Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Jake Matatiao. I'm a lecturer at UCLA AUD. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Albert Pope, the Gus Sessions Wortham Professor of Architecture at Rice University. Pope teaches in the School of Architecture's undergraduate and graduate programs and is the director of the school's Present Future program, a year-long research-based initiative that explores the prospects of urban and architectural design from the perspective of our current environmental conditions, namely climate change. Pope approaches issues of climate change and the warming of the planet as a cultural problem of the first order, one that demands a radical rethinking of how and where we live. In his own work, this rethinking focuses on the urban implications of climate change, and in particular, on new models of density in light of the extraordinary demands soon to be placed on the global urban environment. Pope is the author of Ladders, a study of the post-war American city, originally published in 1996 and thankfully reissued by Princeton Architectural Press in 2015. The second edition includes a postscript by Sarah Whiting, who writes, quote, "Ladders was my introduction to Albert Pope. I read it long before ever meeting him. But it wasn't long enough for the book not to have been already out of print. Over the years, I repeatedly checked it out of various university libraries. I repeatedly Xeroxed it. I repeatedly assigned it to students," end quote. The experience described by Whiting was similar to my experience with Ladders, a book whose contemporary importance cannot be overstated. I remember reading key passages in the basement of Columbia University's Avery Library, photocopying those key passages so that I could take them home and extend my dialogue with Pope, wanting more, and so quickly returning to Avery and spending more time with the copy machine until finally succumbing and copying all 200 plus pages. Ladders has been and continues to be indispensable in helping me read and understand urbanism's past, presents, and futures. For those of you listening and watching, you'll be able to submit questions via the Q&A box within the webinar, and I will read your questions at the end of the talk. Albert Pope, welcome to UCLA AUD.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks for the invitation. The introduction was pretty good as opposed to what I'm about and what I'd like to talk about today. Before I start, I want to say that I'm not an activist, and I think it's pretty important to make a distinction between being an activist and being a designer or being an architect. That we need to find that line where what we are doing is, of course, engaging the problem and trying to make sense of it. We're trying to make sense of it in terms of how it can help us to design. My feeling is that anytime you're in a crisis, the most important thing is to do your job, as opposed to perhaps switch jobs and maybe focus on other political or aspects of the problem. So I want to put that in at the beginning. The first 5 or 6 slides are really about a read on the climate problem, but it's hopefully set up in a way that leads into the design responses that we've come up with so far. So the question to start out with is, what time is it? This is an image of Houston in August 28, 2017, when the Hurricane Harvey came through and transformed the city and really transformed our imagination. It's probably similar in California. We were sort of anticipating climate change to happen 10 years, maybe 20 years. Maybe I'd see the effects of it, maybe I wouldn't. And when the storm came through, or when we see all the fires in California or in Australia, the question is, what time really is it in relation to this crisis? Are we not already in the middle of something? Or are we maybe, is it too late to actually respond? I think this kind of temporal conundrum has made it difficult for us to engage the problem. I think that the sort of loss of our temporal bearings has induced a kind of paralysis that the work that we're doing is trying to re-engage. because I think until you can really grasp the problem, you can't really, you can't expect other people to deal with the problem until you have a head around it, your head around it, and until, in fact, you can start to show some ways forward, some paths, if not some solutions. And that's what we're trying to do. So the image on the upper left, some of you may recognize, is the RCP paths. These are the International Panel on Climate Change. The way they do their studies, their latest one in 2014, is to break it into paths that play out scenarios with different levels of carbon in the atmosphere. And my best guess in reading everything since this has been made is we're right at that white dot. But one of the reasons I really wanted to show it is that this is like a timeline that's exploded. These incredibly different futures out there, in a sense, magnifying and multiplying. It is very, very difficult to know when we are and where we are. Our temporal bearings are in many ways scrambled. So the information that's below really comes from 2015 and gives us one time limit, which I can pin my talk to. 2 degrees Celsius is the maximum temperature rise that we can endure and still have a planet that's compatible with the economic, political, and cultural expectations of contemporary societies. 3 degrees will result in massive displacement of populations due to inclement weather, sea level rise, and global food shortages. 565 gigatons of CO2 is the maximum load that the atmosphere can absorb and still limit warming to a 2-degree rise. Our present rates of emission, it will take only 15 years until we reach this limit. This is a 5-year-old, this is Bill McKibben's number from 2020, numbers from 2015. And here's an attempt to lock into time, 15 years, right? We have 15 years to avoid the 2 degrees, exceeding a 2-degree rise. I have to say that from what I can tell, many people have passed that mark and are looking at the RCP 8.5, the top one, which gets us to a minimum at 3 degrees. In addition, he added this: 3,000 gigatons of unburned CO2 are in the fossil fuel industry's reserves and on which the industry is valued. This is 5 times the number that would put us over 2 degrees. That is to say how out of sync we are, our economy, as well as our thoughts, are with the limitations that we're facing, regardless of the time frame. Where we start is with a broad number of cities count for 2/3 of the world's average energy consumption and 70% of greenhouse emissions. 75% per capita reduction in energy expenditure will be required to keep these resources in the ground. What would a city with a 75% per capita reduction look like? Reduction in energy consumption look like? That is the low estimate that you see on the graph. We think this is an architectural and an urban problem. That there are a lot of ways to describe it and the problem of climate change. And as I just said, these are oftentimes the mathematical ones are very confusing. One thing that we can do is to simply and emphatically show what a city would look like if it achieved what we needed to achieve. Before I launch into that, I need to also make a point about scale and again about time or acceleration. You may know the idea of the Great Acceleration. You may know the idea of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, you've heard the term before by now, where human activities are the dominant force in the planet, meaning that we've moved from the Holocene to a new geological era that is actually marked in the Earth's crust. When the when that was first floated seriously, they had to find a start point, and the people who first floated it said, "Oh, it's at the onset of industrialization, say the end of the 18th century." Like all scientists do, they studied that, and one group came back with evidence that suggested that the start date of the Anthropocene coincided with the emergence of mass consumerism at the middle of the 20th century. And they supplied these graphs to make their case. Natural climate disaster, species extinction, GDP, populations, rainforest loss, international tourism. These are the natural measures, telephones in millions, coastal nitrogen, ozone depletion. These are more of the human systems, fisheries, urban population, motor vehicles. These all spike in 1950, which is remarkable for me. It means that this is a very recent problem, and that we are on this upward ramp, also called the hockey stick diagram, which is in many ways putting the resources and our infrastructures at peril. It's a mixed bag. What this huge spike in productive activity amounts to was taken on by another group of scientists. A 2017 study estimates the mass of the global technosphere, the material habitat that humans have created in support of the species. Massive fleets of cars and airplanes, continental expanses of managed landscapes, billions of buildings, and the physical and electronic infrastructure that supports it weighs in at 30 trillion tons, some 5 times the weight of human beings that it sustains. This is approximately 4,000 tons of transformed Earth per human being, or 27 for each pound of a 150-pound person. Virtual exoskeleton for the species. Everything we do through this so-called technosphere. Prepare a meal, buy a shirt, message a colleague, fill a prescription. In spite of its importance to basic survival, these activities and the familiar objects that enable them have come to be perceived as threats to our survival. As it turns out, just being human and alive in the world today requires a significant carbon expenditure that cannot be simply sloughed off. Our portion of this is really here. This is an image of Houston, not far from where I'm sitting, on a major freeway. In fact, the widest freeway in the world. It's 25 lanes across. And it is indicative of both the scale and the speed of the great acceleration and the resulting effect. So the reason I have this labeled here, push-pull acceleration, is that we know that people are moving into cities at an incredible rate, right? You heard it 10 years ago that half the population is now here, now it's 60%. But what we don't really pay more attention to is as we're moving in, the cities are growing out. We have not produced any density. We have been on a negative trend of density since 1950. We have been steadily de-densifying since 1950 as our cities have grown. There's a relationship between this acceleration and de-densification of dispersion, which I think in many ways is a useful frame for the problem. So this freeway is 25 lanes. It was open. Within a year, it was jammed again. The question obviously being, if Houston will double its population by 2040, is this going to go to 50 lanes wide? I think not, for reasons of hypertrophy, that we are at this limit of acceleration, accelerated extension and expansion. And the proposal that we are working on and have been working on for 5 years is, what would it look like to reduce or reverse that, to push towards a new model of density in response to the circumstances. So the bottom on the bottom left-hand corner of the slide is a famous graph. You've probably seen it. It's energy in the vertical dimension and dissipation in the horizontal dimension. The farther apart a city is, Houston and Phoenix on the upper right-hand corner, the more energy is expended. The tighter and more dense the population, Hong Kong down in the lower left, the less amount of energy consumption and emission. And it's an enormous delta that between these two, we have the ability, within the context of urbanism, urban design, and urban reform, to start to close this gap, to start to think through what density might look like at this day and age. The graph on the upper left is the per capita energy consumption, follows from that previous graph. United States is at the top, Europe and Japan are in the middle, and the rest of the world and the world average and China are down at the bottom. But also down at the bottom, surprisingly enough, is Hong Kong. Hong Kong is calculated like, in a lot of statistics, as if it were a country, which means we get this sort of unique view of it. It's the only city in the world that even comes close to a world average, to what we would need to achieve if we were to keep the surface warming down. And that, to me, was enormously, I think that's enormously important. It means that we can pursue a modern urban environment. We can build a city that makes sense in the context of our present society, and still meet this level of cuts in energy expenditures and emissions. The problem is also presented in the slide, which is that we haven't built anything dense. We put some dense buildings up, but we really haven't built any dense city in 70 years, at least not in the United States. We built on top of 19th century infrastructure, piling masses on top of a rather small urban grid, the Manhattan in this case. And that was analyzed by Corbusier when he came to the United States in 1939, wrote a book, included this diagram, which had his assessment of the problem. And as we know, his, for many people, very scary solution of a radiant city, where you had even more density than you had in 1900 and 1939, but you didn't have congestion. In other words, the idea of a radiant city is that if you build dense, it has to be accompanied by open space. You can't just row buildings ad infinitum onto a grid and expect that to function in any reasonable way, especially at this point in time. It's just the greatest luck that Manhattan has these two huge voids on either side of it that relieve the extraordinary densities that you get there. This is a map that was done in Berkeley, Cool Climate Network, where they were able to calculate emissions, carbon emissions per zip codes. And I think it's pretty important. What you're looking at in the left on the big circle is really the greener the area, the less carbon emissions, the redder the greater. that traditional urban densities were obviously very efficient, because what you see pretty much coincides with the outline of pre-war New York, where the city was built up and out into New Jersey up to, say, 1950, after which, at the exact moment of the Great Acceleration, a new type of urbanism took over. And for all of its characteristics, the one that we're looking at this right this second is this red, intense, carbon-emitting urban environment. You probably know the word megalopolis, Wash, Boston to Washington. The entire megalopolitan region built after 1950, or at least connected up after 1950, is this red and orange smear. And it's obvious that what we are building now is not going to function. It's not going to carry us through the next decades. And by hook or crook, it may have to, but in terms of what we need out of the city to survive this coming century is not what has been built in the last 50 years. So one of the responses that we've made, I've held on to this photograph for a really long time. It's the Berlin Unité, and there's a huge coal-burning power plant, Kraftwerk Reuter, which is adjacent to it, which seems to make the Unité, for me, a little bit more contemporary and less of a dusty relic of our past. Much of what I'm going to be talking about today builds on the legacy of modern urbanism, a legacy that was really cut short for many reasons, and it's actually for many good reasons. Sometime around 1972, at least according to Charles Jenks, and has more or less been off the table since that time. And the need for us now to go back and look at that, pick up that strain of our legacy, that particular 50 years of development that in many ways address the problems we face now better than anything that we've done since. And I know I'm gonna have to prove that to you, but let me do it this way. These are three, if we look around at what urbanism is being built now, what its framework is, what its premise is. I've picked out these three projects. All three, one of them is a OMA waterfront city in Dubai that was not built. Below that is the Renzo Piano Daimlerplatz, which was built in 2000. And then Foster and Partners' infamous Masdar City, which was started in 2007 and has since been abandoned. They're all superblock projects that are designed by a single hand, a very famous single hand, yet they imitate a tradition of aggregate urbanism. They are master plan imitations of cities that were aggregated over relatively long periods of time. In other words, they're producing an image of relatively small buildings that were built at different heights by different people over different time. However, each example is the product of a high-end boutique economy. Each uses the economic surplus to produce a hyper-articulate massing that seeks to emulate 19th century urban fabric. Each example celebrates the postmodern split between architecture and urbanism. I'll get to that in a minute. Each example attempts to revive a grid-based typology nearly 70 years after its demise. I'll get to that in a minute too. The split between architecture and urbanism is manifest in these three brief quotes. Keep in mind that these are the most technologically advanced offices operating on the planet. They make a point of being on the cutting edge of technology, of innovating with technique and material, and that innovation is the core of their architectural expression, right? They're hyper modern in many cases. So here is OMA. The development consists of an artificial island linked to 4 distinct neighborhoods. The island is divided into 25 traditional city blocks that permit a rational, repeatable urbanism redolent of Manhattan. Located north of Waterfront City in Madinat al-Sur is a primary residential neighborhood employing the vernacular qualities of historic Arab settlements. The dense building clusters, irregular streets, pedestrian paths connect a patchwork of delights in this town. Followed with Masdar City and Norman Foster. Inspired by the architecture and urban planning of traditional Arab cities, Masdar City incorporates narrow streets, the shading of windows, exterior walls, and walkways, thick-walled buildings, and courtyards and wind towers. Foster is a disciple of Buckminster Fuller, who would remark in response, how much does your building weigh? With regard to the proposal, the thick-walled buildings and courtyards. And finally, the piano, Daimlerplatz, with its surface area of 600 square meters, the scheme has the dimensions of a small town. And like a village, it is designed around a piazza, the focal point of the project. We have a village, we have a souk, we have the 19th century core of New York, Manhattan. What is it with the progressive ethos of modernism? What is it with these architects that on the one hand, they are at the cutting edge, and on the other hand, they are looking deep into urban history in a way that seems schizophrenic? It's what I meant between the split between architecture and urbanism that I think in some ways we're suffering from in ways that I will explain. It means that we need to, I think, more than a souk or a village or even Manhattan, the models, I'll just repeat this, the models that are most useful to us are the ones that were formed in modern urbanism up until the time it was more or less dispensed with in the early 70s, never to return. And as I said, for good reason, on the left-hand side, you have the infamous Plan Voisin by Corbusier that would tear out X number of block medieval fabric of Paris and replace it with cruciform high-rises. That netted in reality, Pruitt-Igoe down below it, which you probably have heard of it. It was built in the 50s, lasted no more than 16 years, and began to be demolished in 1972. Alison Peter Smithson's Streets in the Air, the Smithson's chapter of modern urbanism is extraordinary. This was just one of their drawings, and their major demonstration of their urban ideas was Robinhood Gardens, which you see down below it, which was demolished in 2018. This is for many a failed legacy. That the buildings were in many ways unworkable, ill-advised, and whatever experiments were going on there, they need to be stopped, right? I would argue, I argue with that premise. I don't argue with the fact that there were failures, although I think especially in Robinhood Gardens, the jury is out on that, even if the building is demolished. What I take issue with is the fact that if you fail, you don't quit the project. You don't abandon the laboratory, right? You figure out what went wrong, which in some ways the second generation, the Smithsons, Team 10 did, and you try it again, right? You continue the legacy of experimentation. Why would we do that? This is a quote from Bruno Latour, and I think this is my last quote that I'll read. There's something deeply troubling in many ecological demands, and he's writing this today. to suddenly leave no more footprints on a planet we was already modified through and through, it might not be the time to sound the retreat and to betray the progressive ethos of modernism by suddenly becoming ascetics, by which he means being poor and withdrawn, like a monk. If modernism was Promethean, the massive acceleration of a green economy and clean technologies that scientists argue is needed would be Prometheus squared. And yet, it is still unquestionable that there's something deeply flawed in the hubristic tone of so much hype about technological solutions to ecological crises. Read geoengineering. Is there a way, however, to explore a positive, energetic, innovative set of passions to repair and pursue the modernist experience at a more fundamental level? Can Prometheus be reconciled with the seemingly antithetical notions of care and caution? I come back at this material in that spirit, and in that sense of returning to the laboratory, not only because I think there were qualities in this chapter of modernism that have yet to be fully plumbed, but I actually don't see that we have a whole lot of a choice. And in this way, I absolutely cherish this legacy, as you will see in what follows. Where I take off, and let's say this is the third or fourth round of experimentation, is a kind of closer read of what modern urbanism was. This is the book that comes from the book that Jake was talking about. I'm not going to go through it. I really don't need to. It's kind of, I don't know how I managed to write a whole book about it because it's so simple. We tend to think we live on a grid because a lot of us still do. Like if you're in the LA basin, you probably think the city is a grid and that's the end of the story. If you live in the middle of New York City, same thing. But we know, and you probably know upon reflection, that it really looks like this, that since the 1950s, that extent of gridiron has been eclipsed or stopped, essentially that spread by a new form of development that is based on spines or cul-de-sacs, which is what the latter was in the book, and that we really live in this world where this kind of urbanism has been foreclosed for whatever reason, and that we are now the citizens of the spine. It works out perfectly in Houston because we have a loop road that's like a tree ring in 1950. Outside of it is all spine-based. It's a little bit different in Southern California, but I know you felt it if you have gotten off the freeway in Orange County. If you live in LA County or live in the basin and on a grid, and you get off, you take that 405 down, you get off the freeway in Orange County, and where the hell am I? That this world is so completely different than the one I just left. And that difference is between the grid and the spine. They can be set up as opposites. Again, I can refer you, or you can have a look at the book if it interests you further. The reality is that we don't even live in that, we live in this, that by now, 25% of the built environment is gridded and 75% of the built urban environment is laid out on a cul-de-sac. Again, that's a little bit difficult for you to see because of the geological barriers in Southern California, yet it pertains. It also matches the fact that for those of you who know Paris, inside the boundary, the freeway boundary of Paris called the Périphérique, 20% of Parisians live. And they live on that grid, the sort of opened up medieval grid of Haussmann, outside the Périphérique on cul-de-sac territory that is based not on continuities, but on discontinuities. 80% of the people live, they don't live in single family houses, or not many of them do. They tend to live in housing estates, but the urban structure is the same. If we want to find a new urbanism, think through what density is, we need to regard this as its DNA, as where that idea of a new urban density would come from. I'm going to pass this by. This is a study that was done by Ludwig Hilbersheimer. Mies is less famous co-director of IIT. He actually wasn't the co-director, but he in many ways did direct it. He did urban studies that is based on exactly this. What is a spine-based urbanism? It is the underpinning of modern urbanism. How does it produce space in a way that traditional urbanism didn't? What are its advantages? This is one project that he did where he took Rockford, Illinois. This was the thought experiment. Started out as a grid that aligned to the Rock River, Ford in the river, grew out as a spine on the north, south, east, west axes. And then his amendments of it were to turn it into a kind of spine-based formation that looked all too familiar to us in the context of contemporary urbanism. But what he was after was thinking through the city as an organism. That if the city had made any sense in its natural context, because he was an early environmentalist, it would acknowledge the form of a river. If you're going to put a city on a river, probably it ought to be linear, according to Hilbersheimer, or at least he had a scheme for doing that, such that this city, his replan Rockford, fits in almost like an organism within the greater context of the Rock River Valley. It opens up the spines it clears the floodplains for one thing, and it opens up the spines to the air and views of the river. It meant something different to him than it does to us today. And I think it's important to see that spine-based urbanism, there are bad spines and there are good spines, just like there are bad grids and there are good grids. And if we have an ounce of objectivity, we recognize that the spine has the chance of producing an excellence in urban design, the qualities of environments and spaces that equal or exceed the qualities of spaces, forms and spaces that we get out of the grid. At least that's the premise that we are undertaking and are using the spine as the underpinning. So we're connecting back to that legacy that I mentioned to, all the way down at the level of its organizational logic, its ground plane. We did this project, and this is since I only have 45 minutes, we've done several based on it, but this is the one we've done most completely. We did it in 2016 for the Venice Biennale. I was joined by Jesus Vassallo, Gail Chen, Daniel Kuhn, Qin Longyi, Peter Stone, and Louis Wise. And we worked through this scene for a area of Detroit called Coketown, which is directly adjacent to the Central Business District, which is just to the right off of the slide. Courtown, you can probably guess it was originally a site for Irish immigrants, and had seen its better days and has lost 75% of its building fabric. It is now today surrounded by freeways, cut off from the rest of the city, and is, except for a few new developments up there, is falling apart. We were given this site, which is a 2-block site, which is an old post office sorting facility, as a way to think through how do we as designers revivify Court Town? What can we do as designers to bring Court Town back to life? Well, we can take this 2-block site, make a spectacular monument a la the Bilbao Guggenheim, and it will have an effect that will transform the entire neighborhood. That has really been our urbanism for the last 30 or 40 years. And if you bear with me for one more kind of didactic slide, we can look at 2 discrete methods of urban design. One of them is indirect, and it's as old as cities themselves. This is a Noli plan of Rome. And what you see in white, this is the Pantheon, are the public buildings. And they are the hierarchical elements. And the urban fabric moves around them and is secondary to them and is shaped relative to their positions. The urban fabric changes much faster than the monuments, obviously, in Rome that were built for the ages. And there's a sort of primary and secondary relationship, and a way that urban redevelopment was organized historically, in many cases, whereby if you go and either insert a monument or upgrade or renew or expand a monument, you will expand the whole area around it. That is a very different way of thinking of the secondary material than modernism had. This is back to Corbusier. This was done by vernacular, and traditionally the fabric of the city was designed by a vernacular building culture and was taken on by individual owners in large part. What Corbusier and Wright and Mies and other first-generation modernists said is that industrialization has profoundly changed our cities. What we now must do is directly design that fabric. We can't just design monuments and expect that good things around them will happen because of the drastic changes brought about by industrialization. Their idea was directly design the fabric. When modernism failed in its first iterations, let's say with Pruitt-Igoe, 1972, up till today, and the destruction of Robinhood Gardens, architects were in a pickle to not exaggerate it. It just so happened that in 1971, about the same time that Pruitt-Igoe was being prepped for demolition, there was a competition in Paris for the Pompidou Museum. And it was in many ways thought to be a way to revive the Beaubourg district. That if you build that exceptional monument, which is now the most touristed site in one of the most touristed sites in the Western world, then it will by osmosis change and reform the city around it, right? That all we need to do, we don't have to change the fabric ourselves. Owners can do it, individual architects. All we need to do is focus on this monument and the change will move out of it. That absolutely worked. And as you know, or if you don't know, haven't been there, look on Street View. It was completely transformed in a way that was totally convincing. It's interesting to think that if the Pompidou had been proposed 10 years earlier as a mode of redevelopment of the Beaubourg district, this probably would have happened. It happened actually next door to it in Les Halles, where they did a tabula rasa rebuild of the old market area. This could very well have been the outcome had it not been, had we not lived another decade through the experiences of modernism, and in many ways found an opportunity to atone for the failures of this model, the direct design model, by returning in the spirit of postmodernism to a much more traditional dynamic between the monument and the street, And it worked, and it worked again, and it worked again. Um, uh, and uh, uh, Today, it is really how architects imagine our urban interventions as being the focal point or source of urban renewal that spreads out from them. It's interesting to see that when Gary went to Bilbao in the 90s, that was the agenda. When Candelas, Josephs, and Woods went to Bilbao in the 60s, this was their agenda. Same city, different architects, very different dispensation of urbanism, very different understanding of what urbanism was and can do. Candelas, Josephs, and Woods, which were part of Team 10, contemporaries of the Smithsons, were trying to develop the direct design of the city by the building of this urban fabric, not in the middle of the city, but on the edge, on the outside where the city was actually being built. And as opposed to Gary's response, which was to go into the pre-modern core of Bilbao and build a new monument and generate the city that way. One of the biggest problems, I think we should still do or practice urbanism in the mode of Pompidou. It worked in the Bowery with the new museum to some extent. It was already underway. But we also need to recognize two things. One, let's call the Bilbao effect what it is, which is gentrification. And number two, let's recognize that that pre-modern urban fabric is completely limited. There's only 20% of the built environment. All of our problems with the cities cannot be resolved by redesigning or upgrading the core, especially the monuments of the core. We have been fixated on that to the point that we've neglected 80% of the city in a way that previous generations didn't neglect it, in a way that I think we need to go back and think through again. So our point of departure for the Corktown project was this wouldn't work, that there's not enough substance there to transform, and that what we need to do is take on the entire area in a direct design fashion, but one that very much goes back into the laboratory, studies the problems, and comes up with another solution. This is actually what we put on the site that we were given, which was a hotel and apartment building and office building and a small convention center made out of cross-laminated wood timber. And this was, again, the office done in the diagram. The site we were given. This is the Detroit River out front. This is the site we were given. Our first stage was to replace the existing building or just take it apart and turn it into a nursery and to start to rethink the problem of how, if we're not going to make a spectacular monument here, which will reform all of this, how are we going to take on these 255 blocks? That was our first move, turning the post office into a greenhouse because trees were important. We found the Hans Woodland project that was in Detroit, planting trees like crazy in urban forest. That it's a fantastic solution. Look it up. We used part of that as our strategy for the project. Ultimately, what we were trying to do is to put the city, think of the city, corny as this sounds, as part of the carbon cycle. Is it possible to think through urbanism today in a way that would integrate it into the natural cycles? In other words, could the technosphere, as I described it earlier, be integrated into the biosphere, being the carbon cycle? We did it mostly with material, and that material was wood. The fact that wood stores carbon, that you can build out of wood, that wood is urban forestry, and can be also seen as amenity. One of the great successes of the direct design, at least in this country, is Lafayette Park, which was a couple miles away. We used that as an example. And we phase this thing. No more tabula rasa. We're building out over time as the old fabric phases out, new construction phases in. So we're not tearing anything down before it's time. You can see the houses here. The idea really is that buildings in the United States are on a fairly short building cycle, 25 years for commercial, 60, 70 years for residential, average out to 50 years. What that means, as a thought experiment, if I go out to Main Street, teleport myself to 50 years from now, get out of the time machine, look around, everything is going to be rebuilt 50 years from now. If we look back and see that the oldest building that's around us was actually built in 2020, from the perspective of 2070, we are able to ask a question. How did we do? Did we build what we needed to build in that building cycle? That you can think of building cycles over time as a design opportunity, as the design opportunity to integrate into an existing building cycle and to aggregate an urban environment in a way that is very different from, yet similar to, traditional urban production. So we came up with an alternative for typology, which we called the search space. And you can kind of see what it is. They're simple algorithms. This thing goes from up to down. On this axis, we move this block from the left to the center to the right. On this axis, we carved out a courtyard or an L configuration. We combine those three algorithms, that's what they are, simple instructions, into an overall space, knowing that each one of these spaces, buildings in this space would work well with others, and we would be able to assemble out of the pieces and parts a whole that was greater than the sum of those parts. Again, risking a bit of corniness, that if the parts of the city don't interact with each other, then you have no city. And the traditional typologies that we use are not adequate. Our programs are too complex, too big to use traditional types. We need a more fluid version of type, based it on the number of sources, and use that as the catalog for the development. This is jumping back to probably 2035. That's where the Big Wood building would be. We're proposing that all of these be, all of the new construction be cross-laminated timber. The every other block ends up being open, along the lines of if you build density, you must build open space. And those open space we build with the trees following from Hans Farms, and also recognizing that these tree plantations are significant carbon sinks. And from probably somewhere 2035, we could use that to manipulate the density, the search space, by changing out selections, and ultimately build out a fabric over time that achieve densities that would allow for mass transit, would sequester 11,000 tons of carbon in the green space, would give us 52 units per acre, and drop our energy consumption 160 BTUs per capita. So in some ways, I would say that this is a kind of housing estate, right? This was designed all at one time by one group of people. It was designed more as a system than as a master plan. And obviously it could be played out in different ways, but we are able to take advantage of the scale of contemporary construction. These could be built all at once as a super block. They could be built as separate buildings. They would probably need to be built as super blocks to get the economies of scale that we need. And just to finish up, this I stole it from another project. We also, this is a study for the wood cycle. Wood cycles, if you cut it for carbon every 25 years, it's on a different cycle than the building cycle is on. So what we did is played those two cycles off of each other, where the trees are growing faster, being cut back as the buildings are in their first cycle. giving you some important connections. The importance of urban forestry to modern urbanism cannot be overstated. That's the build out. This is the block. I'm out of time, so I'm thumbing through this just so you can see that our ambition to tie architecture to urbanism was followed through on, or attempted to follow through on it, all the way down to the construction. The use of cross-laminated timber, we used an SOM project as a model, an engineered project to do this one from. And that's it. That's the end. Thanks. I never know how to end a Zoom lecture.
Thank you, Albert. That was, yeah.
I'd be happy to take questions. How's that?
Thank you.
If we have time.
I think we have some time for some questions. So for anyone who's listening and watching, please type up the question in the Q&A box at the tab on the bottom of the screen here. I thought I might be able to kick us off while questions start to come in.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me try to find a way to. I have a question about capital and thinking about. You said at the very beginning that you're not an activist.
Right.
And I don't expect you to play the role of developer or policymaker either. But I was wondering how you might begin to think about aligning, let's say, financing models, policy, as a way of implementing and executing,
Yep.
Thinking about the implementation and execution of some of these design propositions at this scale, which needs to marshal a number of resources, including, soft and hard resources like physical labor and capital, to put it, and policy. So how does all of that also sort of get marshaled into design implementation and execution?
I think when we do projects, we recognize that there would be a number of ways, a number of paths that we could take to get them developed. One of them is the fact that we do it in different phases, and so that we're not taking on a massive projects all at once. We're doing them incrementally, as well as transforming the neighborhood incrementally. But beyond that, projects that we've set up in Houston have been set up strictly on public-private partnerships. There are quite a few models that could be applied, but I can also answer it to you this way, that we know now more than we have in my lifetime the limitations of the market. We have ignored the limitations of the market, its inability to solve the problems that we now have. Solve environmental problems, solve even something as simple as gentrification, right? Our faith in the market, I would say over the last 5 years at least, has been seriously eroded. And I was asking, I might ask you, the other day, when did we start taking the Green New Deal seriously? Was it during COVID? I think it might be. When it first came out, because I was on top of the environmental stuff, it was poo-pooed a lot. It took carbon credits off it just did a lot of stuff it didn't need to do. And it was just, this fantasy. And who gives a, that's not, maybe it'll help. At least it gives us some publicity, right? But I would argue that sometime over the last 6 months, even, that's changed. And the prospects of thinking through, and this is going to sound weird, thinking through what a return to Keynesian economics might mean, or maybe to put it more simply, what would a welfare state look like in the 21st century, right? what if there was a recognition that the market cannot by itself give us the solutions we need, either social or environmental solutions, not that they can be separated, and what would be needed to either come and take over in large part, as the WPA did, building projects, or to seriously go after public-private partnerships in a way that we can say that we can admit that the market is not going to solve these problems, and that we need a combination of public and private investment in anything that we do. In other words, I'm counting, we have a leapfrog scheme. We're doing work here where we're taking houses out of the floodplain that should never be built. And you can do that on a leapfrog scheme where you take the third row, which is going to be the first row after the demolition, and using the future wealth of that to make the project happen. What we're trying to do is leverage our own improvements to make those improvements happen. In other words, there are a lot of ways to do it, but I think even in the 5 years since we did this project, I think for me, it has more resonance because we see some alternatives that even a year ago weren't obvious, and can in some ways anticipate a sea change in the way we think about urban development.
I also think, just to follow up on that, I also think that we've seen in the last 5 years, and most recently the last 8 months, huge market failures. The failure of the market to deliver on basic needs, right? So there's more probably of a willingness in the public domain to look for alternative solutions.
Yeah, I would make a claim for design around that there's so many things. I mean, to sort of get through what's coming at us, design is going to be incredibly important. There's no client for this project I showed you, and there never would be, right? This is done by cultural curation, which is great. But the point is that the market is not capable, not that it's wrong, not even that it's bad, it's just inadequate, especially given the problems that we're facing. And that's especially true for design, because design will have to do so much more than it's doing right now in order to approach and work against these problems.
Yeah. Thank you. I have a number of questions that have come in, so I want to do justice to them. So Ife wrote early on, for the carbon emission graph of New York City on page 8, could it be, this is the red and green diagram, could it be possible that the low emission in the inner city green area happens at the expense of the higher emission red area surrounding it?
At the expense of, in other words, you wouldn't have that low emission in the green area if there wasn't all this carbon around.
New York needs Connecticut, New Jersey. Right. Like that's how I'm reading the question.
Yeah, and I think that would be an interesting one to explore. I think that New York and New Jersey and Connecticut could have been built at more than 5 units per acre, and could still fulfill whatever function it's fulfilling now for the New York region. In other words, there's nothing necessarily that ties the New York region, the New York City, to the greater region that demands that the greater region be built out at such low densities, right? It definitely needs to be there. It's the scale at which we build now. We can't ignore that. But in the fashion in which it's built, I would argue that it's helping no one, right? It's exacerbating the problem for people inside the city and outside the city, not because of its existence or its monetary value, but simply because of the building types that were chosen to develop the surrounding area, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of an answer. I think
Yeah,
the question is probably better than,
Yeah.
I think your question is better than my answer. But it would probably take a lot of thinking to sort that out. But I do think there's something to that. That of course we can't, I mean, some people think we can, everyone in the megalopolis should just pile back into the grid. There are a couple of books based on that premise, for one. And it's not realistic. It's not to scale, given where we are, at least not without a huge population drawdown. So I certainly acknowledge the existence of this, of the area being developed, just not being developed in that way.
There's a question here from Brittany about alliances. What kind of, and I think you've already answered this in part of in answering the question that I posed at the beginning, which was, what forms of alliances do architects need to make with policymakers, developers, environmental agencies in order to directly design the fabric of the, sorry, I just popped, of the built environment? How do you imagine these phasing large-scale changes in urban form, density, and transportation? So transportation over the course of not only multiple building cycles, but also multiple generational shifts in policy changes in a city. So thinking about alternative time horizons, I think there's a question embedded there about alternative time horizons.
I think I think if lots of people did projects like this, that sooner or later they would get the message. It's at least the policymakers that design has a role in this. And why don't you look a little bit more closely at design, recognize that what it can do that you cannot presently do. I don't think people take seriously the idea that urban reform has anything to do with our environmental problems, for the simple reason is that they simply think of the city is totally fixed in concrete and it never changes, it never alters, because that's what you think, unless you study, right? Unless you know, or unless you live long enough to see changes around you in an area that's changing. You really don't know how malleable cities are, and that there are these moments of intervention where you don't have to destroy the present infrastructure to produce a better one. That infrastructure can time out. That building can time out in a coordinated planned fashion that would allow it to be replaced with something better. So I think the way that we make connections and inroads for design into policy and even into culture is, I think all we can do is show, right? It's what I was saying at the beginning. What is a city that would allow for a 75% reduction in energy consumptions look like? That's what we can produce, right? We can make that image. And I think we can, in many ways, insist on it. And again, if we look back to the 50s, we see that in many ways there were successful connections made, even if bad decisions followed from
them. Yeah. Maybe a couple more. Let's see. Danny Jimenez writes, given your research on urban form, how do you view the legacy of the new urbanism movement? Was there ever a time, now or in the past, when your project could have been allied with new urbanism's embrace of traditional urbanism for new developments?
I think that the 19th century, if the more recent new models of new urbanism from the late 19th century and early 20th did not confront the problems that we confront by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, think about it. It's before freeways, before any contemporary development. You know, big box stores, airports, huge airports, and it was before we saw urbanism as a carbon emitter, right? That was not a problem that the 19th century had to deal with. I think we can learn a lot from them. My biggest problem is if you look at the projects that I highlighted, and I must apologize in a very ungenerous way. I was doing it quickly and to make a point. I usually don't trash things like that. But these, number one, these are all high-end projects. I don't think we can reproduce traditional urbanism given today's economies for anyone but the 1%, 10%. At least that's what these projects, how these projects were proposed. These are not widely disseminable urban models by any means. And even if they were, it's hard to imagine how they would play out in the context of, say, all of that red and orange stuff on the previous map, right? We have to, it's like people come to me in Houston and say, well, we need to have walkable urbanism. I agree with them, but then I can tell that what they want to do is turn Houston into Brooklyn. And that's just not going to happen. By any stretch of the imagination, the scale of the city, the way it's laid out, the discontinuities that I was explaining before, we have other opportunities that they never had in Brooklyn, that if we don't exploit, we're gonna miss out on our chance to build something as good as Brooklyn was in its moment. And I won't go into it, but there's some pretty concrete examples. So I wouldn't, you know, there's a lot of the urban fabric in we used a 300-foot module in the search space with the types. And even though there were lots of buildings that were built all at one time, some of them were super blocks, most of them were not, but they were joined together into a single development. The scale of this really is the scale that comes from the grid of Detroit. So even though that we're building much more on it, and we're actually thinking of a large scale, right? This entire edge right here could be developed through economies of scale all at once. We're thinking of Lafayette Park scale, right? We're not thinking of a house by house by house scale. And when you're there, you really have a very different approach to urban problems and urban possibilities than you would if you were simply trying to apply the typologies of the past. Lafayette Park, if any of you are ever in Detroit, I dare you to go and see that and tell me it should just be townhouses, right? It's an incredibly convincing project because it was taken on at a large scale and produced an enormous amount of open space and an enormous amount of density, and is today a solidly middle-class environment. There are successes that we can point to, and I think Hilbersheimer learned from traditional urbanism. He certainly tied with the low-scale courthouses. He tied into the fabric in a way that was knowing and accomplished. He knew where he was and how to respond to it. But beyond that, this is not a traditional typology, and I could argue that it's better for it.
What's really exciting to think about at that scale too is the kind of your provocation to integrate the technosphere with the biosphere, and so to be very specific, to think very specifically about materials and materials that weren't online in the way that they are now with CLT. I think that's very, very exciting.
Yeah.
I think piggybacking on this will probably be the last question. It comes from Emmanuel, and it probably ties into thinking at that scale and thinking about why Houston can't be Williamsburg, moments of Houston can't be Brooklyn. He says, Emmanuel writes, this may be an overly simplistic question, but in discussing the spine-based urbanism that makes much of our fabric, you mentioned that there are good spines and bad ones. I imagine that the bad ones are pretty easy to spot. That widespread suburban sprawl is not the answer. But what constitutes a positive approach to this type of large-scale urban expansion?
Okay, we can start with Lafayette Park down below. If you look at one of the reasons that Lafayette Park succeeded and other redevelopment projects failed is because they reorganized the infrastructure. They took out streets, just in the way that Hilbersheimer had done in those larger plans I was showing you. They took out streets and made this large green sward on the side, and they reconfigured the streets. They tied into the existing streets, but they reconfigured them and terminated them in the right places to feed into these large spaces that they had made. I think that the first thing is important to recognize is that the spine is not limited to the structuring of single family houses, that the spine is everywhere, right? The spine is on the periphery of Paris. The spine is in the new territories of Hong Kong. The spine is what we've been building. Discontinuous spine-based urbanism is what we've been building pretty much everywhere since the 50s, or in Asia since the 70s, really, depending on where you're looking. But it is, in the way that I'm sort of equating it to the grid, is to say that there's nothing inherently limiting about it that I would, it's nothing I can back up, because there's not very good versions for me to point to. But I sort of have it, on faith that the quality of environments are not limited by whether it's on a spine or on a grid. If you know what you're doing, right? First thing you need to know is a spine is different than grid, and you design for a different. So I think that if you separate the urban form from its many bad examples, which is what the book was trying to do, and say, let's just take the form at face value. What does that give you? That you see potentials that were probably before, because before, when you were looking at a spine, all you're thinking about is single family cul-de-sacs, right? You have single family houses in cul-de-sac. And that's an incredibly limited way to look at it. So it's not a question at all. It's a kind of key that we need to isolate out the underlying structure in order to just understand it as an organizational system, apart from the many manifestations of it, in order to give it a fair hearing or a fair use in design as a design methodology. The last thing I would say is, I can say this, but I can promote the spine, but I don't need to. It's going to happen anyway, right? This is not. I'm promoting looking at it and trying to do something with it, not make more spines, because that's a foregone conclusion. 80% of the built environment is already made that way.
Yeah, I really love this ethos that you brought to the discussion earlier on about just because the experiment failed in the first pass doesn't mean we give up on the experiment. Right. We just learn from the mistakes and try to do better next time.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Albert. This has been a real pleasure, and I wish we were all I wish we're all together and we're able to kind of celebrate and kind of clap. But I'm sure that judging by the attendance and the questions, it was well received by the students and faculty. Thank you.
Good. Thanks a lot.